Open your eyes and your mind to the realism of Nintendo 64 as you play Super Mario 64.
Mario.
Submerge in a 3D environment with 15 worlds of beautiful graphics at 10 special areas, and of course, Mario. Move an incredible 360 degrees as you embark on Mario's greatest adventure to recover the stolen Power Stars and defeat his mortal enemy, Bowser. Mario acquires special abilities by changing hats. Fly with a feathered hat. Use the invisible hat to vanish. And become invincible with the metal hat. Use these powers to combat giant 3D enemies as you see the action through Mario's eyes. 64 megs of power and battery backup let you experience Mario like never before. It's Super Mario 64.
2025 is starting to feel like the true start of a turning point for 3D platformers. For the last 20 or so years, this genre has been kind of treated like a side dish. And I've talked about how much I absolutely love 3D platformers ad nauseum and 2D platformers. The games were treated like something that you revisit, once in a while, when Nintendo drops a new Mario or when a remake shows up to cash in on nostalgia. But this year, in particular, feels a little bit different. There's a wave building. And for the first time in a long time, it doesn't feel like an accident. For players who grew up in the 90s or the early 2000s, 3D platformers were virtually everywhere. Mario 64 changed how we see video games. Banjo-Kazooie filled worlds with character and secrets. Even games like SpongeBob, Battle for Bikini Bottom, like I've talked about many times, became cult classics because they captured that sense of play, that sense of joy and exploration. And then things shifted. By the 2010s, platformers were smaller scale, smaller in budget. They were kind of niche. They existed, absolutely, but they weren't driving the conversation anymore. And now, in 2025, coming off the first year that I can remember in a long time where a 3D platformer won Game of the Year in Astrobot, 3 games that I want to talk about are putting this genre back into the spotlight. DonkeyKongBananza, Yooka-Replaylee, and SpongeBobSquarePants Titans of the Tide. One has already landed, and other 2 are right on the horizon. And together they paint a picture of why this year feels like the year of the 3D platformer. Let's start with Donkey Kong, my GOAT, one of my favorite games of all time. Nintendo finally did it. After decades of keeping Donkey Kong in the 2D lane, and even then, the games they released were sparse and far and few between, they gave him a full 3D adventure once again. And the last time we had a 3D Donkey Kong game was 64 back in '99. That game's reputation is complicated. I've talked about it quite a few times. I love the game. It's remembered as much for its overwhelming collectible count as it is for its ambition. But it was proof that Donkey Kong could stand in the same 3D space as Mario, even if he felt a little clunky and clumsy doing so. Bonanza doesn't try to repeat Mario. It builds around Donkey Kong's very own strengths. Movement is about power. It's about weight, rhythm. Vines and barrels are a lot more than just dressing in this game. They're the heart of how you move throughout this world, climbing on the gates. All of this worked perfectly. And the return of King K. Rool at the end was the cherry on top. The levels are fun, very different from what we've seen in a Donkey Kong game before. They're vibrant, but without being cluttered. They're exploratory without being super overwhelming. They are designed to a T in perfection. It's Nintendo, but it's Nintendo taking a risk yet again. And this was the Nintendo that I missed. And then there's Yooka-Replaylee, which isn't out yet, but has already built some serious momentum, especially since it comes out just over a month away on October 9th. When YookaLaylee first launched in 2017, it was, and still is, pretty divisive. As time has gone on, people have warmed up to it, and I would say it has generally positive reviews. I like the game. Some players saw it as a loving tribute to Banjo-Kazooie, while others thought that it was too rough, it was too dated, even when it came out. Replaylee is Platonic's chance to rewrite that story. They're calling it a full reimagining, a full remake. From the ground up, new mechanics, overhauled levels, a refined moveset, and quality of life fixes galore. The anticipation for Replaylee isn't just about correcting the past, because YookaLaylee, by all accounts, was a perfectly serviceable 3D platformer. It's about proving that a smaller studio can and should stand tall in a genre dominated by giants like Nintendo. Yooka and Laylee are stepping out of Banjo's shadow and into their very own spotlight, which was the biggest issue with the original. If the game delivers, which I'm sure it will, it could be a landmark moment. Not just for Playtonic, who definitely deserve it, but for the idea that 3D platformers don't have to come from the biggest names to matter. And that is the perfect segue into the final game that I want to talk about. SpongeBob, Titans of the Tide. This one's interesting because it shows how licensed games have changed throughout the years. For years, decades, licensed platformers were rushed tie-ins of a movie or a show. But SpongeBob has always been an exception. Battle for Bikini Bottom became an instant hit and a cult classic, and when Rehydrated hit in 2020, it proved there was a real appetite for SpongeBob in this genre, in this space. Then the Cosmic Shake came out just 3 years later and kept that momentum going. Even if it didn't land with every single person, it was still very well reviewed and sold incredibly well. A perfect sequel. Titans of the Tide is being positioned as the big step forward, finally using Unreal Engine 5, leaving last generation behind, only releasing on PC, Switch 2, PS5, and the Xbox Series consoles, bigger hubs, bringing back Patrick, levels pulling inspiration from every corner, it looks like, of this show's history. There is so much here. The Flying Dutchman and King Neptune interacting for the very first time in franchise history in a video game. Purple Lamp Studios has continued to prove time and time again that they were the perfect hands to handle these games. Titans of the Tide could elevate SpongeBob from cult favorite status into one of the most reliable platforming mascots out there. He's already up there with Crash. I would argue he's up there maybe even with Sonic or something like that. Maybe not quite Sonic, but Spyro for sure. Maybe not Sonic, but definitely I think Spyro. He's gotten so much respect, not only as a character, but just as a platforming mascot in general. He's in my banner, for crying out loud. So why does all of this matter? Well, it shows that finally, the genre is healthy again. And I don't mean just selling okay, selling good enough to keep the genre alive. It's genuinely healthy. Donkey Kong represents the legacy side. One of gaming's oldest icons finally being given his due back in 3D. Yooka-Replaylee represents the indie side, the idea that smaller studios with passion and persistence and perseverance can take risks that big studios just won't. And SpongeBob represents the licensed side. Proof that franchises often dismissed as, quote, kid stuff, can actually deliver top tier fun and platforming experiences. It's also about timing. Players are getting exhausted of the same old formulas. Massive open world stuff with icons, live service grinds, endless sequels trying to look as realistic as possible with microtransactions and battle passes. Platformers cut through all of that needless fat. They're colorful. They're focused. They're playful. They remind us that games can be fun without all of that extra garbage tacked on. 2025 is shaping up to be the year where 3D platformers stop being looked at as a relic and start being seen as essential again. Bonanza has already proven there's an audience waiting for this. Replaylee and Titans of the Tide could cement it, and the fact that they're both 40 and 50 bucks, not even full priced, just further helps their case. And if all three hit the way that they are expected to, we'll look back on this year in particular as the start of a real revival.